For the last generation or so, Britain has been stuck in a constitutional quagmire. Since the 1997 half-baked attempt at reforming the composition of the Lords, later it was added to this the 2009 new UK Supreme Court, and more generally, a larger drift towards convergence with EU legal and political practices, especially pertaining to the European Court of Human Rights. All this, of course, undermining the principles of the common law and of parliamentary supremacy. This has been aptly described, I think, yesterday by Sir John Hayes here as constitutional vandalism. Then, in 2016, Brexit happened, and one could have hoped for some repairs to this vandalized system. However, 7 years after the referendum, there hasn't been any serious attempt at anything. So now the Constitution neither reformed to fit some clearly defined blueprint, nor restored to its previous structural integrity. The British Constitution now resembles one of those houses where the money has run out mid-renovation, and people are like stuck with all the, right? This is a political version of the house renovation TV show, Grand Designs. Now, of course, this situation makes people come with all kind of new ideas. Well, you know, if we're renovating, why not do this, why not do that? So we hear that Starmer has already declared that if elected, he intends to completely abolish the House of Lords, replacing it with an elected upper chamber, perhaps a federal house. Didn't you know that the United Kingdom is a federation? Too bad for you. So, meanwhile, the Supreme Court, which had been established in 2009 as a judiciary that is totally unconnected to Parliament for the first time in British history, delivered in 2019 the judgment that the prorogation of Parliament by Boris Johnson at that time was unlawful. Now, irrespective of the value of that judgment, this very judgment positions the Supreme Court as supreme to Parliament, because it can decide if Parliament is right or wrong in what it's doing. And no less problematic are thousands of lingering EU laws and regulations, most of which the current government finds it unable to scrap for some reason. So these are just some among the direct and implied threats to the Constitution. Best described, I think, by the words of Edmund Burke as the metaphysics of an undergraduate and the mathematics and arithmetics of an exciseman. So, how are conservatives supposed to address this? Maybe reject all change, or perhaps adopt some strange compromise like the halfway reform that the hereditary lords have been in since 1997. Well, the obvious problems with these approaches is that it leaves the initiative to the left and leaves conservatives basically as dragging their feet. Now the question is, can there be a conservative vision of constitutional reform? I propose that it's more profitable to start thinking about these issues in a different way by adopting a Burkean, let's say Burkean principles to constitutional reform. So let us try to understand what they are. The overarching framework for constitutional reform should be Burke's view that the whole scheme of our mixed constitution is to prevent any one of its principles from being carried as far as, taken by itself, and theoretically it would go. What does this mean? It means that the British Constitution is not some simple Lockean structure with a strict separation of powers based only on a democratic justification. Instead, it is a mixed constitution, that is one mixing democracy, a democratic basis, with other non-democratic checks and balances. What Burke described, and I think that Professor Starkey mentioned, the principles of a republic grafted upon a monarchy. So what do non-democratic checks and balances look like? They are different in different countries depending on the history and circumstances. We have to look only to the US to find some of them. For instance, the US Senate, as you know, is composed of 2 members for each state. This undermines, of course, the idea that every vote is equal, because clearly a number of states that have a fewer population have vastly more influence than the larger states who are represented by the same number. By the way, another prominent non-democratic feature of the American Constitution is the Electoral College, which makes it possible for a president to be elected even though he doesn't have a majority of the popular vote, which has happened in the past. So in the UK, of course, the balances are different because unlike Starmer thinks, the UK Constitution is not a federation. So the checks are more historical in nature. And however, like the US, the upper house, in this case the Lords, is the place where the check to the more direct democratic urges are located. So we should look at this as having described the framework. What can we do following the Burkean principles? So I propose 3 principles that Burke used when describing circumstances where the Constitution was broken or partly destroyed and was reformed or restored, like after the Civil War and at the time of the Glorious Revolution. First of all, because of the historical nature of the British Constitution, it's important to retain as much as possible traditional forms and structures of the Constitution, always balancing improvement with preservation. Secondly, remember that the British Constitution is not a simple and abstract a priori Lockean structure. This means that, in the words of Burke, that every reform is a kind of experiment. It's an experimental science. So changes should be gradual and careful and measured. And the third is that we should clearly define the practical goals that any constitutional change is supposed to achieve. So now, in order not to leave things in the abstract, I will describe briefly how such principles might be applied to some needed constitutional reform now. Perhaps call it a kind of restoration. So we have seen that the most current attempts at reform touch the House of Lords. It used to be dominated by hereditary peers and functioned as a supreme judiciary of the country. There was a group of peers selected as the law lords. So this basically has been destroyed. As you may recall, the House of Lords Act 1999 was an uncompleted attempt at overhauling the upper house. It results in the current situation where there's 92 lords that are elected by all the hereditary peers. There's another 25 bishops who serve as long as they're bishops, and then another about 700 life peers, about 40 of whom are disqualified from sitting for various reasons. So the result is a nominal total of more than 1,500 lords, about half of which are qualified to sit in a chamber that has become a gigantic and largely ineffectual part of the Constitution. Having lost its hereditary legitimacy, it hasn't gained an alternative one. So along the years, various changes to this setting have been proposed, all of them intended to make the Lords into simply a kind of an electoral chamber, totally or partly directly elected. which would create a situation where it competes with the Commons for legitimacy. And there might be a situation where one chamber has one majority and another, and so on and so forth. And also, all these proposals would effectively end the 700 years of Lords in Parliament. So instead of following these proposals, I think that the Conservatives could consider following actually Disraeli, who initiated a reform of the franchise rather than following the Liberals. So a Conservative initiative reform of the Lords would aim to preserve both the ceremonial form of the House of Lords as well as the functions of the upper house as part of the Constitution. So to achieve this, the reform should retain the House of Lords as a repository of experience and tradition, as the symbolic center of the Constitution, where the judicial, legislative, and executive powers live together and cooperate, as a functioning chamber with a manageable number of members. Remembering that for most of its history, the Lords had between 100 and 200 members. Only since the 19th century, it has ballooned to an enormous number. And all the while taking care that the reform would not undermine the powers and authority of the Commons and the Cabinet. So a reform of the Lords that is in line with tradition would first retain the full House of Lords as a kind of ceremonial House of Lords, which all peers keep their titles and can attend ceremonial events like the coronation or state funerals or the king's speeches. Then a smaller, let's call it an executive committee or executive council, will be formally set up. Let's call it the Great Council, which was actually the name of the Council of the Nobility until 1640. And it will have a more compact membership. Out of the 1,500 Lords, this Great Council will have, let's say, 230 members. It's about a third of the Commons, which will carry out the actual work of an upper house of the legislature. And third, the members of this Great Council would be selected after each general election from among the Lords in some kind of mechanism that reflects what each party received in the Commons. In this manner, by downsizing the House of Lords, it will have gained manageability, prestige, and effectiveness, while ensuring continuity and integrity. Its legitimacy, I think, will be enhanced by the combination of both the electoral mandate and the experience and compact composition of the membership, and it will also have the same party majority as the elected House of Commons. Moreover, to the Great Council, there should be also added the judges of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court should be restored into the House of Lords, because this recent separation between judiciary and Parliament was problematic to begin with and leading to growing constitutional friction. So in this way, we restore the original role of Parliament as the High Court of Parliament. So to conclude, following these Burkean principles, such a reform of the Lords could reinvigorate the Constitution while restoring its traditional forms and functions. Thank you.